Agneta was the much-beloved daughter of the king and queen, whose castle stood not so very far away from the great lake itself. Many an evening she would go off wandering in the woods, she would go down to the shoreline, she would paddle a little in the waters, she would amuse herself in all sorts of ways. And it was the case that one midsummer, as the sun was riding high, the solstice itself the very next day, she went down to the shoreline, she wandered around and around, and she went out onto the wooden platform that stretched out into the waters, where people would come and moor their boats. And she sat on the end of that wooden pier, the jetty, and she dangled her feet in the cooling waters, having taken off her shoes first, of course. When she saw something in the waters, and at first she thought it was a fish, come up to perhaps have a nibble at her toes. But as she looked closer, she saw swimming into focus in the waters a face that looked almost human. And as she watched bewildered, expecting maybe a swimmer, one of the fisher lads who dived into the waters perhaps, coming to the surface for air, she saw coming up through the waters the face of a merman. Part human and part fish, handsome and charming and deep-voiced, with eyes that you could drown in, soulful, doleful eyes. And the merman said, "Agneta, day after day after day I have watched you hidden here in the waters. I have looked up and seen you staring into the waters, but I have always been so deep down in the waters that you have never seen me. And over the months that I have been watching you, I have fallen madly and deeply in love with you. I yearn for you." Agneta's heart was stirred and not just a little afraid as well. And she said, "I'm flattered, I'm charmed, but my father already has chosen a husband for me. We will soon, in a matter of months, be married." The merman said, "Your husband, is he a king?" "No, no," she said, he's a lord, but he is not a king." "I am a king," said the merman. "I am the king of the sea itself, for whilst I dwell now in a palace at the bottom of this great freshwater lake, there are routes leading off of the lake out to the great salt oceans of the world, and they too are my domains. I am a king of the most vast and enormous realm, greater than any lord could offer you. You wander in the world up here, you see the plants, you smell the flowers. I have seen you doing so when I've watched you from the waters, but you have seen nothing and understood nothing compared to the beauties of the world that is beneath the surface, the world that is below, on the ocean bed, on the river bed, on the lake bed." And she was enchanted to sit and listen to him as he told her tale after tale of the fish and the octopi and the squids and the sea horses and the reeds and the water flowers that bloom in sunlight and some only in moonlight, of the pearls and the jewels and the amber that may be found on the bottom of the ocean bed. Tale after tale after tale he told her, and she was lost, listening and listening, such that she didn't really notice when a hand stole up and caressed her foot and her ankle, and then crept a little further and rested on her knee, that strange and clammy webbed-fingered hand that held her there. And as he wove his tales, his charms, his magic, spread not only in his words but through his fingers and into the young princess, and she was enchanted. And when at length he reached up and he took her by the waist and pulled her into the waters with him, she gave a little squeal at the coldness of the waters, but she was lost to him. And she said, I cannot swim very well at all. Don't let me go, I may drown." And he said, "My dear Agneta, with One kiss, you will breathe underwater. And at that he kissed her. And whatever strange magic was in him passed into her, and indeed, as he had said, as he sank below the waves, taking Agneta with him, she found that she could breathe underneath the water as well as he could, as well as any fish could. Down and down and down into the lake they went, deeper and deeper and deeper, and at first it became so dark she could barely see a thing, but then gradually, and perhaps this too was his magic, her eyes adjusted, and she was able to see in the gloom at the bottom of the lake, looking up at the last of the sunlight of the eve of solstice as it died on the surface of the lake. Even when it was dark above, with the moonlight falling on the water, there was still light enough to her newly bewitched eyes that she could see the fish and the eels and the creatures and the strange things that dwell in the waters. Not only the strange things that most of us are familiar with, but strange things that we humans very rarely, if ever, get to see, that lurk and live in the depths of lakes. Until finally they arrived at the very bottom of the lake, and he took her to his palace so deep down that no human fisherman, no human diver had ever gone that deep, had ever seen into the darkness at the bottom of the lake to realise that there was a palace there, grander than the palace which Agneta had been born in and lived all of her life in. He showed her room after room after room filled with ornate furniture grown from amber and coral and driftwood and all manner of things that comes to the bottom of the lake, brought there not only by the fresh waters, but when he had been out in his saltwater realm, the things he had found there and brought back in to the lake itself to augment his wonderful palace. Agneta found that days became weeks, weeks became months, months became years, time began to blur for her. And when she was lonely and she remembered her life on land, remembered her father and mother, remembered her brothers and sisters and her cousins and the various people of the court, and grew a little lonely for them, the Mer King would sing to her, tell stories to her, show her fascinating and wonderful things, and such was the magic he would weave that she would forget the world above, forget her life before, and know only him, think only of him. 8 long years she lived in the lake. Well, 8 years that were long for her mother and her father and her brothers and her sisters and her cousins, but they were not long years for her, because time, as I say, blurred, and day became week and week month and month year. And it was difficult to tell the passage of time at the bottom of the lake. Each year she fell pregnant. Each year she gave birth to a mer child, blending features of mother and father, part human, part fish, part creatures of the deep waters, some of them freshwater children and some of them saltwater children. And she lived in the castle as a wife, as a mother, as an adventuress on their journeys through the watery realms, not only the fresh waters and the lakes and the rivers of the world, but the great oceans themselves. She travelled far and wide. She saw ice floes and tropical islands. She saw all manner of strange and wonderful things, from the frozen northern wastes to the great Sargasso seas. But at the end of the 8th year, when the solstice was approaching again, they came back to the palace in the lake to rest after one of their many, many adventures. And she sat in her chamber, rocking the latest infant in its crib, and she heard something in the distance, and at first she couldn't make out what it was. She couldn't quite hear what it was. And she felt it was familiar, but she didn't quite recall. It was one of those tip of the tongue moments as to quite what it was that she was hearing. And she listened again, and dolefully in the background she heard the chiming of a church bell. Probably she had heard the chiming of the church bells many times in the past, and been so enraptured with tales and music and song and adventure that it had passed her by. But on this one occasion, for whatever reason, the sound penetrated her consciousness, and she heard it and acknowledged it and knew it. And with the sound of the church bell came memories of church services, came memories of sitting on the family pew at the front of the church with her father and her mother and her brothers and her sisters and her cousins and the servants of the castle and the various courtiers and the people of the local village, and the old priest up front reciting the hymns and leading everyone in singing the songs and the prayers and the Bible readings, and it gradually came back to her, little by little by little. And she grew lonesome. And when she told her husband of how lonely she felt, of how nostalgic she was for news of her parents and her brothers and sisters and so forth, at first he tried to tell her stories and suggest to her new adventures and sing her songs of the ocean depths and of the lake depths. But she said, no, I don't want any of that. I just want to go home. And all night long they discussed it and debated it, and she insisted and insisted, and as much as he tried to beguile her and charm her and redirect her mind, she came back to it again and again, until at last he relented and said, yes, yes, my love, you may go back, but there are conditions to your going back, for a short visit. And the conditions are this: you must tie up your hair in a great bun, for as it is at the moment great and long and flowing like the seaweeds of the waves, encrusted with pearls and amber beads and jewels, and it has to be said, with strange creatures and shellfish and things with far too many legs that skittered and writhed in her hair, as befits a woman of the lake and a woman of the oceans, but would look awfully strange on a woman of the land. You must not let your hair down when you are on dry land, nor must you speak to your mother or father. You may listen to them and whatever it is that they say to you, but you must not speak to them, nor tell them where you have been. Nor, if you go and visit them in the church, must you kneel, or pray, or sing hymns, or read that book. And at the end of an hour's visit, you must return to me in the waters of the lake. Or memories of us will fade and fade and fade, and your life under the wave be lost. And so with the dawn light, husband and wife swam up to the jetty. She clambered up onto the wooden pier and looked back at her husband and her children bobbing in the waters behind her. And she went on dry land, her hair done up, dressed in the strange clothes of a water woman. And off she wandered, remembering the way after those 8 years had passed, noticing trees a little larger and saplings growing in places where there had been no saplings before, and hearing the bells of the church for the morning service. And there she went, and people oohed and ahed as they noticed this strange woman, and most of them, after a moment's hesitation, recognised her. Her mother recognised her, her father recognised her, and oh, they looked old, they looked haggard, they looked careworn. For 8 long years they'd fretted and worried and thought, was our daughter drowned in the waters? For they had found her shoes on the very edge of the jetty. And sometimes they'd wondered, had she wandered off into the forests and been eaten by bears or wolves or wild boar? And sometimes they thought maybe she'd been abducted by some crazed lunatic, and who knows what might have happened to her. At first they wondered maybe she'd been taken by pirates and a ransom would arrive, but no ransom ever did. And such is the way of things, that even after 8 long years of resigning themselves to the fact that wherever she was, she must be dead, they still fretted and worried and thought that wherever her body lay, it had not been given due burial. And all of those fears and worries and anxieties had weighed heavily upon them and aged them terribly. And as soon as Agneta saw how haggard her mother looked, how careworn her father looked, she called out to them, "Mother, father, And she spoke to them, and she sobbed on their shoulders, and then the brothers, and then the sisters, and the cousins, and the beloved servants that she'd known all of her life, one after another, and going from person to person, hugging and kissing, and in all of that, her hair that had been done up so tight became looser and looser and looser until it slipped in cascades down her shoulders, down her back, down to her very kneecaps. And people noticed how strange her hair was and the odd things, watery things, caught up in her hair. And she told them that she'd been living in the lake with the merman all of these years and how wonderful it'd been to her, and he'd given her rings and jewellery and this and that and the next thing. And her mother was so overwhelmed. She said, let us give thanks to God, let us pray. And she called to the priest to lead them in a hymn of thanksgiving. And the priest led them, and the whole family began singing, and Agneta herself began singing. And then suddenly the singing froze. And Agneta looked from person to person, and each of them was fixed in position, mouths half opened, frozen like statues, and the light that had been pouring in, the midsummer light from outside pouring in through the window, seemed to go darker and darker and darker. And there she heard a wet sound at the door of the church. And as she turned back to look to see who it was, it seemed to her as if all of the statues of the various saints that stood around the church cowered and hid their eyes and turned away, as if they had sprung to life and moved, fearful of what entered the church. And there was her husband dripping water from the lake as he came in and said, "Oh, Agneta, Agneta, you have let down your hair. You have sung the hymns. You have spoken to your mother and your father and your brothers and your sisters. All of the things I asked you not to do. It will be so hard for you to come back to the lake now, but come nonetheless." But Agneta had said, "I remember all that I was before you charmed me into the waters. I do not want to come back. My place is here, with my mother and my father and my brothers and my sisters. My place is on the dry land." And the king of the seas pleaded and he begged and he said, "What of our children, all 8 of them? And they weep, they wail for you, they fear they will never see their mother again." And Agneta, her heart hardening, said, "I do not care for their tears. I do not recall them barely at all. They fade from my memory, and if you were not stood in front of me, you too would be fading from my memory into a dream, into a nothingness, into a half-forgotten twilight." And as much as the king of the sea begged and begged and begged, she would have none of it, until finally he relented and returned heavy-hearted to the watery depths, and his 8 children, who never again saw their mother any more than he saw his wife, except with the occasional glance when he would swim up to the lake surface and see her in the distance on dry land, for she never once stepped foot upon the wooden pier again. Thank you.